Stewart. It's Tuesday, August 15th. This is Africa 54.
There appears to be little hope for a swift end to the fighting in Sudan. Analysts say the conflict has reached a stalemate, both militarily and diplomatically. The death toll mounts in the U.S. state of Hawaii as emergency workers search amid charred rubble for more wildfire victims. And hundreds of volunteers in Mozambique have created reading camps in Manica Province to fight illiteracy. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54.
United Nations and other international organizations on Tuesday are calling for peace, access to humanitarian support and respect for human rights in Sudan at the 4-month mark of a war that has led to food shortages, deaths and sexual violence. Henry Wilkins has more from Joda, South Sudan.
A few hours earlier, Nyalan Far crossed the border into South Sudan and returned to the land of her birth after fleeing the fighting in Khartoum. During the journey, she gave birth to a baby girl. She described the city on the verge of collapse, with parts of the population under bombardment.
Aircraft were firing missiles over people and gunshots were fired at people. When I escaped, I did not carry with me even a single piece of clothing. My neighbor was shot along with her little daughter, who's only 3 years old.
Many people who fled Khartoum told VOA they are hoping for a swift end to the conflict so they can get on with their lives. Some analysts say a narrow window for dialogue about stopping the fighting in Sudan may have opened. A report last month from the International Crisis Group, a Belgian-based research group, said the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, had gained an upper hand over the Sudanese armed forces, the SAF in Khartoum, suggesting the SAF may be more willing to come to the negotiating table. According to other analysts, the window may have already closed, if it ever existed at all.
But I would not agree with assessments that some have made to suggest that either the RSF was about to take back control of Khartoum. The future of the country depends on there being only one national army. And I just don't see how we can get there through a kind of political process that folds in elements of the RSF into the SAF.
Before the conflict started, attempts were made to merge the once friendly, now warring military factions. Diplomatic efforts to get the parties back on the same side have so far been unsuccessful.
What's problematic about this is that one side will always see one of these tracks as being biased. So unless we have one very strong, broad coalition of international partners that can come together in a way that is not perceived as being biased.
Daniel Dain, who has also recently fled from Khartoum, says he does not know how long the conflict will last.
Life in Sudan become very bad for us, especially with South Sudanese. That's why we decided to come here so that we can go to our homeland. So up to now, we don't see this situation whether it will end, because all houses were being burned. So they are also they have killed so many people.
Diane says he dreads having to rebuild his life in the ruins left behind by the war. Henry Wilkins for VOA News, Joda, South Sudan.
For more on Sudanese conflict and humanitarian crisis, I'm joined live via Skype from here in Washington, D.C. by Fred McRae, Senior Director, Humanitarian Assistance at Coros International. Fred, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you for having me.
As far as you know, Fred, describe for us the situation, the humanitarian situation in Sudan.
The situation continues to deteriorate. Sadly, you're seeing over 4 million people have been displaced and driven from their homes. This means that their families and communities are struggling to access basic services such as food, shelter, access to health care and sanitation facilities. It means that children are out of school and that lives have just been disrupted. The longer the conflict goes on, the more families and communities will continue to suffer.
The United Nations, Fred, says more than 4.5 million people have been displaced in Sudan. Tell us what intervention measures donors and humanitarian organizations like yours are doing to help.
For people that have been displaced internally inside of Sudan, humanitarian actors are working to provide those essential services I mentioned, such as health, shelter, and food assistance. In neighboring countries, as you mentioned, 4.5 million people have been displaced. 1 million of those people are now refugees in neighboring countries. So you're seeing the establishment of refugee camps, medical mobile clinics, and mobile support trying to be provided to affected populations that are in need. As hard as everyone is working, as hard as all of the humanitarian partners in all of the countries are working, sadly, the need is outstripping available resources. We're seeing, as the conflict continues, the influx of refugees in the neighboring countries and the multiple displacements of people inside of Sudan is simply overwhelming facilities and support.
Fred, you mentioned those refugees, and we know most of them have crossed into Chad. The others are in South Sudan. Both countries are poor countries. They are having to deal with their own issues. What more is being done for those refugees in those countries to alleviate their suffering?
As you mentioned, Chad, South Sudan, all of the neighboring countries that have very openly have accepted Sudanese refugees. These are countries that were already struggling to provide services to their own population. So you can imagine the influx of hundreds of thousands of refugees into each of these countries is very taxing. So international partners such as NGOs and the United Nations are working to establish and augment service delivery, like I mentioned, around food, shelter, health, and sanitation. Chorus International, under our IMA World Health banner, is working in South Sudan to support vulnerable populations, including refugees, returnees, and host communities through our long-running health, nutrition, and sanitation programming. But once again, the needs are daunting and the resources are not there.
Fred, many thanks for your insight into what's happening in Sudan and neighboring countries. Fred McRae is Senior Director of Humanitarian Assistance at Chorus International. A suspected airstrike in Ethiopia on Sunday killed at least 26 people in the country's embattled Amhara region, according to a hospital official. The strike marked the deadliest reported since clashes between members of the Ethiopian army and a local militia known as Fano erupted in towns and cities across Amhara. For more insight on the tense situation, VOA's Paul Ndiho spoke to Edgar Githua, an international relations, security and diplomatic expert at the U.S. International University in Nairobi.
The government of Prime Minister Abiy is struggling to maintain control, security control in the country, because if it allows all these small regional militia groups to rise up and oppose it, he is going to lose legitimacy and the center will collapse. That is what is at stake. But more importantly, coming to the Amhara region, the mistake, and we could call it a mistake right now in retrospectively, but what Prime Minister Abiy was trying to do was trying to bring all these militia groups that are out there in the country under the fold and the control of his security forces. It is dangerous for any leader to allow warlords and militia groups to be out there, regions operating in a semi-autonomous manner. So he's just trying to consolidate power, but I think how he went about doing it, trying to force the Amhara region and the Fano militia to come back to the fold, I think that is a mistake he might have made. I tend to believe if he had negotiated with them to really ask them to, kind of regulate their behavior and gradually win them and enable them to come into the military on their own terms, he would have won.
How about for people who, for example, say that when what was going on in the Tigray region, he used the Amhara. Now he has abandoned the Amhara and he's using people from Tigray to fight the Amhara. How would you respond to that kind of criticism?
It's classical divide and rule, and knowing that sometimes for political expediency, there are no permanent enemies, no permanent friends, only permanent interests. So when it suited him, the Amharas helped him to fight the Tigrays. If it suits him, he will make a deal with the Tigrays to fight the Amharas. I think that is what Ethiopia is trying to manage. And unfortunately for Abiy, he feels like he does not have the support of the entire country. That puts him in a very vulnerable position, because such presidents or such prime ministers, such political leaders tend to overreact, tend to move from one spectrum of being moderate to dictatorial very quickly, because they're trying to consolidate and keep power. That is what is happening in Ethiopia. If he could get the acceptance from the Tigranians, from the Amharans, and, he has never really gotten to a place where he feels they politically accept him.
You just reminded me of, I guess, one of the greater phrases from one of Chinua Achebe's books, when the center can no longer hold, then
things fall apart.
Things fall apart.
Yes.
Here we are looking at a leader who at one point had a stronghold on the entire country, but it looks like things are falling apart.
You're right. I think what has happened for him is that the war with the Tigray region, with the Tigranians, exposed his underbelly. That conflict showed other parts that he can bleed, he can be defied, and if people are determined, they can put up a fight. He is not a de facto powerful leader, all right? So some of these regions will keep on poking at him, will keep on trying his patience, will keep on trying to poke and prod to see where his vulnerabilities are.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edgar Gitua, for your insight.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul.
That was Edgar Gitua, an international relations, security and diplomatic expert at the U.S. International University in Nairobi, speaking to VOA's Paul Ndiho. The military junta in Niger that deposed President Mohamed Bazoum last month says it may charge him with high treason, which carries the death penalty. J. Peter Pham, a former U.S. Special Envoy for the Sahel and distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council, says all parties need to de-escalate their rhetoric. He spoke with VOA's Carol Van Dam about the ongoing standoff in Niger.
A cardinal rule of diplomacy is you never make a threat unless you are prepared to carry it out. Another cardinal rule is deadlines have to be realistic, and they cannot be set up in such a way as to be self-defeating. And unfortunately, ECOWAS has violated both of these key principles of diplomacy. First, the deadline was set way too long, a week, which gave the junta time to entrench itself, deal with, smooth over any dissent within the military ranks, and in fact, win a lot of the population to its side. So they probably shouldn't have set a deadline that far ahead. Then having set the deadline, they should have been more realistic about what they could or could not deliver. And I know there's been the promise at the summit last week that they would raise a standby force. Standby, it should have been ready already, but a standby force of 5,000 with no indication of where they were coming from, when they were coming together, and to what end, even if 5,000 were sufficient. And I say this with a bit of experience. When I was special envoy of the U.S. for the Sahel, just before I was appointed, ECOWAS made a grand announcement in the end of 2019. Beginning of 2020, they actually briefed it to the UN Security Council that the regional body was standing up on its own, self-funded, $1 billion anti-terrorism joint force that by 2024 was going to eliminate terrorism in the region. This force has yet to materialize, and we are in 2023. So forgive me a bit of skepticism about what kind of force they're going to raise quickly.
You do sound skeptical. What kind of force would you envision? What would make a difference for this kind of force to actually make a concrete difference?
Well, to be quite frank, if you're going to reverse a coup, it has to occur in what my friend, former Deputy Assistant Secretary for West African Affairs, Todd Moss called the golden hour. There's a narrow window right after a coup when it might be possible to reverse it. That window has long since closed. It's very, very difficult for an outside force to come in a situation like this, unless there's support within the country for that force. Otherwise, you're talking about an actual invasion.
That was J. Peter Pham, former U.S. Special Envoy for the Sahel and a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council, speaking with my colleague Carol Van Dam. Officials in Hawaii are working very deliberately on Tuesday to identify the near 100 people who perished in wildfires that ravaged Maui. Meanwhile, survivors are growing more desperate, with the Federal Emergency Management Agency Chief Deanna Criswell saying the recovery efforts could require every tool we have in our toolbox. Diane Tor reports.
Desperation was growing in Maui on Monday for these residents. They'd been waiting for hours in long lines of traffic for temporary permits to get to scorched areas of the Hawaiian island they used to call home.
We got to get back to Lahaina. That's where we're from and born and raised, you know what I mean? And just got to get back to work so I can support my family, you know? And just losing our house, our car.
It's been almost a week since the fast-moving fire leveled most of the historic town. But many residents were still unable to go back there due to the risks posed by possible hotspots and toxic fumes. This woman lived and worked at the Japanese Buddhist Lahaina Jodo mission, which was torched by the fire.
Our temple is, is a historical site, and we do have some things that I saw that are made out of metal and stone that are still remaining, and I just want to make sure that we are able to secure those things. And we've already dealt with so much heartache. It's just like to have to deal with more heartache on top of that. It's just,
Nothing can prepare you for what I saw during my time here.
Federal Emergency Management Agency Administrator Deanna Criswell described at a White House briefing the long and hard road ahead to recovery.
This is going to require every tool that we have in our toolbox. We are not going to be able to rely on all of the traditional programs that we do in the continental United States. And so we are working very closely with the governor to better understand all available options, whether that means longer term we bring in tiny houses or our transitional housing units to help him create the communities that he wants.
The White House said President Joe Biden had discussed with Hawaii Governor Josh Green and Senator Matsuya Hirono ways of housing displaced residents as well as longer-term recovery efforts. It's a grim outlook for the island, with search teams finding more bodies on Monday as they resume the work of combing through the charred debris. Officials also say identifying the victims is a tough task. Since the fire was so intense, even metal structures had melted in the heat.
That was Dan Tor of Reuters reporting. Let us know what you think about Africa 54 and all our VOA Africa programs on our website at voaafrica.com. Still to come, we'll tell you about what's being done to fight illiteracy in Mozambique when we come back.
On the next Straight Talk Africa, in Zimbabwe and Gabon, voters are preparing for next week's elections. In Zimbabwe, the youth want jobs and security amid economic chaos. In Gabon, President Ali Bongo says he is, quote, more ready than ever for a third term. Join me, Haiti Adams, as we discuss the elections in Zimbabwe and Gabon on the next Straight Talk Africa.
You're watching VOA's Red Carpet. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. Thank you so much for joining us each week right here on Red Carpet. We bring you the latest in
In other news, in Libya, Tripoli's most powerful armed factions battled in several districts overnight and into Tuesday morning in the city's worst violence this year, according to an Interior Ministry official. There were no immediate reports of any casualties from the fighting between the 444 Brigade and the Al-Radar Force, or Special Deterrence Force. And child welfare advocates have filed a federal lawsuit asking a judge to force the White House to block U.S. imports of cocoa harvested by children in West Africa. International rights advocates seek to have the federal government enforce a 1930s federal law that requires the government to ban products created by child labor from entering the United States. Hundreds of volunteers in Mozambique are fighting illiteracy in Manica Province. They are creating reading camps that teach children to read in Portuguese. Andre Baptista reports in this story narrated by Barbara Santos.
A group of volunteers are creating reading camps as a local initiative to change the precarious education rates in districts of the Mozambican province of Manica. Carpenters, painters, and farmers are among the volunteers, who work under the guidance of professional mentor teachers and dedicate some of their free time to help local children learn how to read. Artur Maha is a 57-year-old carpenter. Twice a week, he switches from wood and nails to using white chalk and a classroom board.
With my skills and the education that I've received until 4th grade, I can help improve the current situation. What I learned until 4th class back then was better than what children have in 10th grade now.
Sheila Gemussi, a ceramicist, is also teaching in her community.
Child by child, they learn by singing each syllable while playing. We can use modeling clay or other things. We can also teach through ball games. We have several games we can give to children to help them learn.
The initiative targets 102,000 children in 102 public schools in Manica. Officials say many students in rural areas speak local languages at home and do not learn Portuguese, the official language, until they start school. Samuel Lawrence, the Director of Education in Manica.
Some children learn Portuguese for the first time in school. It is a challenge. So there you must reconcile the methodology, look for semantics to precisely decipher some meanings.
Sociologist Reginaldo Muthemba says the local initiative can easily be implemented in other communities.
They see the problem and the community join efforts to create a kind of functional equivalent, a reinforcement, which, in this case, replaces the absence of a capable teacher. So, this is an experience that, in my opinion, could be followed in other communities.
The initiative receives funding from the humanitarian organization Save the Children, and classes are offered 4 times a week. For André Batista in Manica, Mozambique, Barbara Santos, VOA News.
Our health report today deals with our eyesight, vision, the most dominant of our senses, and it plays a critical role in every facet of our lives. Glaucoma is a group of eye diseases that can cause blindness, according to World Health Organization. Health correspondent Kamiti Kibayasi is here with more. Hello, Kamiti.
Hello, Esther. More than 1 billion people worldwide are living with vision impairments because they do not get the eye care they need, including for cataracts and glaucoma. To learn more about glaucoma treatment and other eye issues, I am joined live via Skype by Dr. Belka Kanuda, an eye specialist from MEB Eye Care in Dodoma, Tanzania. Dr. Kanuda, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. What causes glaucoma?
Okay, glaucoma, as you earlier said, is a group of diseases, which is the second leading cause of blindness in the world. It is characterized by visual field loss, increase in intraocular pressure, and damage of the optic disc. The cause of glaucoma is Primarily, we say it's idiopathic from unknown causes, but it can be congenitally or secondary due to some infectious diseases like uveitis, neovascular diseases, lens-induced trauma, or the use of some steroids, and pigmentary. But congenitally, we say the main cause of glaucoma is blockage of the aqueous humor, a liquid which normally maintains the eye pressure. So if there is blockage, maybe through the pathway where it has to go through the eye so as to maintain the eye pressure, and maybe if there is overproduction of it, it causes the pressure to be high. So that's the main cause of glaucoma.
And what are the early signs of glaucoma?
The early signs of glaucoma, as I said earlier, like there is primary and secondary cause of glaucoma. So with primary, we say normally the signs are not clear. You cannot detect the signs unless one goes for a comprehensive eye examination. But with the secondary, one can come with lacrimation, can come with photophobia, brephalospasms. So if those signs, or maybe the cornea is hazy, all those signs are the early signs to be detected for a person with glaucoma. But the greatest sign, if you measure the intraocular pressure, it has to be high, more than 20 millimeters of mercury.
And how is glaucoma treated?
Glaucoma can be treated with medication. If one goes for an early eye examination and is detected with glaucoma, can be treated with some medications, whereby we give medication to lower the intraocular pressure or to increase the output of the liquid. But if it is late, we go for surgery, and there's some indications for the surgery. There is a surgery, we say goniotomy, and the other we say trabeculotomy. If it is, we will see how clearly signs can be seen from the cornea, so that we can opt for either goniotomy or trabeculotomy. And so with medications or surgery, we can treat glaucoma.
Okay. How often do we need to see an eye specialist to avoid glaucoma?
To avoid glaucoma, we advise after every 6 months to 1 year, one has to go for eye checkup, simply because glaucoma is inherited. So one might not know that he or she has glaucoma unless he's examined. So we advise one to go for a comprehensive examination, maybe after every year or maybe after 6 months.
Thanks, Dr. Kanuda. Dr. Milka Amos Kanuda is an eye specialist in MEB Eye Care in Dodoma, Tanzania. That's our health report for today.
Thanks.